We're going to go over lesson 2.4 about deductive reasoning. Let's first define it. Deductive reasoning is a process of reasoning logically from a given statement of fact to a conclusion. So we have two laws today that we're going to define. The first is detachment. Now, detachment is the opposite of attachment. Attachment is when you put the two things together. So detachment is we're going to take two things and pull them apart. And that happens to be the two parts of a conditional statement. That is your if and then. So if the first part of your conditional is true, and the first part of your conditional is called your hypothesis. If your hypothesis is true, then your conclusion is also true. So the way it's going to look, if you use symbols, if P then Q is true, then the P is going to be true, then the Q is going to be true if you pull them apart. So I'll show you how this goes. I'm going to give you the first sentence. So the first sentence is right here. If the two angles are vertical, then they are congruent. Now, there's three sentences total. The second sentence should always talk about the P. Notice how it says P, then Q, then it talks about the P, then it talks about the Q. So let's focus in on just the P, which is your hypothesis. Does the hypothesis, does it get restated here? And you can add a little extra information. For instance, they gave you a name of the angle, and that's fine. A lot of times it's a general rule as the first step, and then it's a more specific rule for the second step. And that's exactly the model that they're following here. So for the third step, which is what can you conclude, you can take your third sentence and make it about the conclusion. So my conclusion, the part that's in yellow says, then they are congruent. So I'm going to take off the word then, and who is they? In step number 2, they told you who they is referencing. So angle 2 and angle 3 are congruent. That follows the law of P, then Q, then the P, and then the Q. So we're done. Now, if it doesn't follow the law, then we're going to say there is no conclusion. But that one definitely followed the law. So let's try part B. Let's look at your first sentence. If it is raining outside, then there are clouds in the sky. So your next sentence should talk about the P. Remember how the first sentence is P, then Q, and then we should talk about the P, and then the last one should be about the Q. Does it follow that law? And looking at it, this part here, guys, this is there are clouds in the sky. That's more like the Q part, not the P part. The P part says it's raining outside. So they're really trying to mess you up. So I'm going to say this does not follow the law. Again, that's this first sentence and this first sentence talk about the same information. And hopefully you're saying no. So what can you conclude? It doesn't work, right? So I'm just going to write no conclusion. Now, sometimes for the first sentence, it's not an if-then form. So I gave you a little hint. It says write it in PQ form. So before we do anything, we need to rewrite it. So I can't say if it's a dog, who's it? So I'm going to say if the animal is a dog. If the animal is a dog, then it's cute. Now I can use it in the second part. That's okay. So I'm going to look at my sentence, take the P part. It should be the same information as step number 2. You can add additional names. The first rule is general. The second sentence is more specific. So they're both talking about a dog. And instead of just saying the dog is a dog, they're giving the dog a name. So if an animal is a dog, I have a dog named Chewy. It's saying the same thing. So what you're going to do is you're going to say the second sentence, but you're going to add the extra information. So the extra information we know is the dog's name. So instead of saying it's cute, you're going to say who it is. So I'm going to say Chewy is cute. And that's it. So on the next one, if today is Monday, then you will go to Cougar Den. You went to Cougar Den today. Now, remember the law. Does it follow the pattern? Does it talk about the P? Talk about the P in the second sentence. And it doesn't, does it? Because they're talking about totally separate things. It doesn't matter if it's talking about the Q that doesn't follow the pattern of the law. So we're going to have to say this is a no conclusion. And we're done. So that is law of detachment. Now moving on, this is the last law of today. It's called law of syllogism. Okay, so here's what it looks like. You're going to have a sentence, P then Q. If you like geometry, then you'll do well on the test. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take the ending of the previous sentence. If then you did well on the test, and we're going to make that the new beginning. So if you did well on the test, and then now we're going to have a new conclusion, and we're going to call that R. If you did well on the test, then your parents will be happy. Now, if you notice, they have something in common. They have the Q's in common. So what we're going to do is we're going to say we're just going to start with the P and go all the way to the Q, or pass up the Q and go to the R. So everything in between has to be correct. So here, let me show you this example. It says if the figure is a square, then the figure is a quadrilateral. Now, let's color code this. I'm going to take the second sentence and start the next sentence with the same information. If the figure is a quadrilateral, now I'm going to have a new ending. I'm going to say, then the figure has 4 sides. Now my final answer is going to be the very first sentence and the very last sentence. My pen will change colors. So I'm going to say if the figure is a square, then the figure has 4 sides. Okay, so this actually ends up being sometimes a lot easier than the previous. I'm sorry that my colors did not change on me there very well. So let's try this, and I will try to color code it. So you're going to start out by saying the P, which if a whole number ends in 0, and then you're going to end with, then is divisible by 10, and that is your Q. Now, we should start the very next sentence with the same information if it's following the law. And if you notice, the 2 green sections are talking about the exact same thing. So now the next sentence or the next part should be a new idea, and that is your R. Now, what is your final answer? Like the green sections, they both have it in common, so this part is kind of like crossed out. And so you're going to say the yellow part and then the blue part. And we have to write it out. All right, so I'm going to write it out over here, maybe not on the line. If a whole number ends in 0, then it is divisible by 5. Okay, see, that's not so bad, but it has to follow the law of the pattern. So it's all about the patterns here. So let's try the next one. If a bird weighs over 50 pounds, and that is your P, and then the next part is my Q, and let's make it green, then it cannot fly. So the beginning of my next sentence should, if it follows the pattern, talk about the Q. Are the two green parts, are the two Qs about the same information? And obviously you can see they're not at all. So can you make a conclusion? Well, you can say that there is no conclusion because it doesn't work. Okay, moving on. If you live in Indiana, then you live in the United States. Okay, so I read too much there. Let's back it up. Okay, if you live in Indiana, that is your P. My Q is, then you live in the United States. So are my two Qs talking about the same thing? Sure, they're both talking about living in the U.S. So we need a new ending. Our new ending is, then you live on Earth, and that is my R. So can you make a conclusion? And we sure can. So we're going to say, let's see if I can get on the blank this time. If you live in Indiana, then you live on Earth. Okay, so if it follows the law, you need to understand that all the sentences in between are considered true. Okay, so even if your final sentence sounds crazy and they don't really match, all the sentences in between are true. So that means that last sentence also needs to be true. So if anyone ever says, is this last conclusion true? You're going to say yes if all of the other sentences follow the pattern of Law of Syllogism. So that's really important to know, and that's usually on the test. Okay, so now we're to the point where we're going to have them all mixed up, either Law of Detachment or Law of Syllogism. And we have to make the third step and write it in, and then state which law. Okay, so there's a lot going on here. So I'm going to write a little cheat sheet over here on the side. So we had Law of Detachment. So this is when we had P, then Q, and then we had the P, and then we talked about the Q, and then we had Law of Syllogism, and this is where it repeats itself, gives you a new ending, and then you have the whole new sentence, P, then R. I want you guys to notice something. On Law of Detachment, you really only have one if-then statement. But when you do Law of Syllogism, how many if-then statements do you have? You should see 1, 2, 3. So that's one way to identify it. So if I quickly look over here at number 1, step number 2, this is only like part of a sentence. This is not an if-then statement. So immediately, without really much effort, I'm going to say, I'm probably testing Law of Detachment. So are those two things the same? Well, I haven't even read the question. So let's go back and let's read this question. If you pass a road test, then you'll get your driver's license. Tamara passed her road test. So if it followed law of detachment, those two green parts, actually, I said that wrong. For law of detachment, it would take the first part, restate it, and add extra information. Because remember, it's pulling them apart. So instead of saying you passed the road test, now you're saying Tamara passed the road test. So you're going to say, instead of you will get your driver's license, you're going to use the girl's name. Say Tamara will get her driver's license. Okay, so I use law of detachment. So let's make sure we circle that or highlight it. All right, so let's make a little note here. Step number 2, it's not an if-then statement, so I'm probably testing law of detachment, which means the two first sentences need to be the same. So if an angle is a right angle, then it's not acute. Angle Q does not equal 90. So are they the same? Well, one says it is a right angle, and one of them says it's not 90. So is this a conclusion? I hope you're saying no. So there's no conclusion. You can't do anything with this. So if there's no conclusion, guys, you're always just going to leave the choices alone. You can't choose one if it doesn't fit a law. So if you want to cross it out when it's no conclusion, that might be a good idea. All right. Again, notice that is not an if-then statement. So are those the same? And they definitely are, because one just says you will swim and the other one just says Jeremy. So we're adding a name to it. So this is definitely law of detachment. And I'm going to say Jeremy will be on the swim team. Will be on the swim team. Okay. All right, we're having lots of the same kind of problem here because this is not a full if-then statement, which means I'm probably testing law of detachment. Are those two talking about the same thing? And obviously they are. The only new information is they gave you the name Julie. So the second part, the Q says, then you can see the show. You're going to change it and add the girl's name. Then you're going to say Julie can see the show. So what law did I just use? I used law of detachment. Okay. Again, look at that step 2. That's, again, not a full sentence. Is it talking about the P of the first sentence? And it's not at all. So they're trying to mess you up. So when it doesn't work, you need to say no conclusion. And then cross out the laws because it's not a law. Okay, number 6. Oh, it's going to be a little different. Good. So I know this is a full if-then statement. So I'm going to look and have to, why won't this change? Okay, I'm going to look at the first part of the second sentence and the last part of the first sentence, and then ask myself, are they talking about the same thing? And they definitely are, aren't they? They're both talking about numbers being divisible by 9. So I'm using the law of syllogism. And so what you're going to do is you're going to rewrite this, and you're going to take out this part they have in common, and you're going to rewrite everything else. So this one has a lot of writing. Let's see if I can fit it in here. If the sum of the digits in a number is 9, then it's divisible by 3. All right. Now, number 7. What do you guys think? Detachment or syllogism? Is it a full sentence or just part of a sentence? Hopefully you're saying, oh, there's 2 parts. There's if and then. Now, they didn't write then here. Now, sometimes just with the English language, we assume the word then is there. Because if I say, if an animal gives birth to young, it is a mammal. The then is implied. So just know that there's really like an invisible then there. But when you're writing sentences, you need to actually write it in. Okay. So are those 2 sentences talking about the exact same thing? And they're not. What this one did is they ended both sentences with talking about how they're both mammals. So I'm going to say this one is no conclusion and cross out my choices because it's not all following the law. Okay. When I look at this, I see 2 complete sentences. Are they talking about the same thing? Now remember, what letter is this? This is the letter Q. Are they talking about the same thing? That's a weird Q. And they are talking about the same thing, both the fact that it's a Romance language. So you're going to end up writing the P, then R. So what law do you guys think I'm using? I'm using law of syllogism. Okay, so let's write it. If a language is Spanish, then, now I know it's implied here in the sentence, but I want you to write it. Then it has Latin roots. Okay, so if you guys want to pause the video and try the next couple and then turn it back on to see if you did it correctly, that might be a good idea at this point. Are these 2 talking about the same thing? Well, supplementary means they add up to 180, and it says they add up to 90. So are they the same thing? No. So this is a no conclusion. On number 10, are they talking about the same thing? And they definitely are. So I'm going to have to write this out. If you live, and I'm going to abbreviate, I'm going to be lazy, SM for Santa Monica, then you live on the West Coast. Okay, what law do you think I used here? Hopefully you're saying syllogism. Okay, last one, number 11. 2 full sentences. So you're comparing the ending of the first, which is the Q, to the beginning of the first of the second sentence, which should be the Q. Does it work? And it says if you're eating food from the dairy group, if you eat food from the dairy group, they're definitely the same. So it's like you cross those out and then you write what's left. So you're going to say the P and then the R. If you eat yogurt, then you are getting calcium. If you eat yogurt, then you are getting calcium. And for the last time, we are doing a syllogism. So guys, that's it. Let me know if you have any questions.